Pardon the interruption. I'm Sam Mulberry, joined as always by
Annie Berglund.
Annie. We have made it to our last webisode of the summer. We're on the eve of exam 3 for the course. So Annie, in our last episode, we talked about the Enlightenment. There are lots of positives that we can draw from the Enlightenment, but is there anything that troubles you about this era?
Sure. So, yes, a lot of the positives about the Enlightenment era, like you said, things like we see advancements in equality, in human rights, tolerance towards other people. We see growth in individual liberty, the development of the social contract theory for governments. But in that, we also see that all of those ideals are limited to, and they're usually limited to white, often wealthier men, landowning men. So some of the troubling aspects, I think, of the Enlightenment is this, that it's not for all. These individual rights, the idea of reason, are limiting because there are beliefs that are developing at this time that, yes, reason makes us stand apart. Reason is our guiding principle. But there are people who are more reasonable or have a higher amount of reason than others. And those people are usually the white men that are writing about it. And so we see these ideas of race develop during this time, and slavery, enslaving these new populations around the world. And reason is what justifies a lot of those atrocities that are done by Europeans around the world. And so we see the conflict between race and slavery as these notions and individual rights. And so the justification of the theft of land, of the slave trade, of systemic violence, is through this Enlightenment vision of reason as the main way that we can take control of other territories. And so we see then at this time people speaking out and acknowledging the ways that the Enlightenment doesn't go far enough or is excluding certain groups. So we see things like the Declaration of the Rights of Women, and other feminist writers rising up at this time and saying, you know what, actually, the Enlightenment ideas of reason and justice and equality is falling short. And women can have those same ideals, but they're not being recognized, or we're being put into a system where we can't actually show the amount of deep intelligence that we do have. And so I think it's the Enlightenment is really important in politics and economics and philosophy for like laying the groundwork for human rights. But it's still a work in progress. There are lots of haves and have-nots. There still are. There are still people who are on the margins and face insurmountable obstacles to being able to fully realize their individual rights and their civil liberties. And so much more so in the Enlightenment period, when a lot of these ways of distinguishing between gender, between race, are being more and more developed and justified. Sam, earlier in its history, CWC used to spend a lot of time on the 19th and 20th centuries. That's not as emphasized as much in the current Gen Ed curriculum, but we do close with a glance at this time period. What are you most happy that we've brought back from the 19th and 20th century?
I think it's helpful that we get to bring the story up to the present a little bit more. Um, and that's sort of weird because as historians, we know that often you're teaching a class that isn't going to get us up to today. But I think there is something with the scope of this class. There is something important about asking some questions about the world we live in. So I'd answer this question in terms of thinking about an idea we've talked about throughout this course, and that is the idea of Martin Buber, that human history is seen as this move between epochs of habitation and homelessness, right? And a habitation or excuse me, an epoch of habitation is a time period where the world sort of makes sense and people feel on a large scale feel at home in the world, meaning that there are systems in place to, establish stability, security, order, and particularly that there are organizing principles that make sense out of the world, a lens through which people view and understand the world. And then epochs of homelessness are when those things break down, when maybe there isn't a single lens through which people view the world. And it's a time period where things not only seem less stable and secure, but also things feel contested. It feels like we have competing ideologies and worldviews and things competing to say what is going to be the new organizing principle. So if we think about this course, think about the last 2,000 years, right? We have this epoch of habitation in the first centuries of the first centuries after Christ, right? Where the organizing principle is the empire, the Roman Empire. Even if you're a persecuted Christian, the Roman Empire is still kind of the lens through which everybody views and understands life. Then we get this breakdown of that. And that leads us into the early Middle Ages. By the time we get to the high Middle Ages, we have a new habitation. And the church is the lens through which we view the world. Then we get to the 14th century. We have the century of crisis. We have this breakdown. We enter a epoch of homelessness. And I would say even things like the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the beginnings of the scientific revolution speak to homelessness. Because you could say those are all competing views to say, how are we going to understand the world? Are we going to continue to understand the world through the church? The people of the Reformation are going to say, no, actually, it's scripture. People of the Renaissance are going to say maybe our lens should be to go back to the classical world and view things through that. And then the burgeoning scientists are saying, well, maybe there's this other thing, maybe science and reason. And then we hit the Enlightenment and we reach this age where reason becomes the organizing principle for life, right? And if we end there, it feels like, well, this is a story about the triumph of reason. But if we push the story forward into the 18th century, and into the 19th century, into the 19th and 20th centuries, we start to see chipping away at that, at this sort of idea of reason. For one thing, in the 19th century, we see this series of thinkers, Nietzsche, Freud, Marx, Darwin, who are pushing this sort of notion of reason to its full extent and really calling lots of things that had been held firm to into question. Then you get to the 20th century, you get the First World War, which calls into question the whole idea of progress, the whole idea of technology leading to progress, a kind of certainty about those things. And then we get to the Second World War, and you have Holocaust, genocide, and nuclear war. And everything feels like maybe all the stuff we thought we knew is actually crumbling and falling apart. New ideas getting pushed forward, even in the sciences, are calling into question Newtonian physics and saying, actually, when you get down deeper, right, the laws of Newton start to break down when you get down to the very, very, very small things. And this is where we get the advent of this word postmodern, right? So one of the things I think is always helpful for us to think about at the end of this course is, in the year 2024, are we living in an epoch of habitation, or are we living in an epoch of homelessness? If you think habitation, and I don't just mean is the year 2024 bad, I mean, like, if we think about the last 150 years, right? If you say we're living in an epoch of habitation, what you're saying is actually this kind of modern scientific worldview really has kind of won out. That really is how we still understand the world, how we still describe the world. And yes, there's been bumps along the way, but that's kind of, we still think pretty rationally, pretty scientifically about the world. If you say we're living in an epoch of homelessness, I think what you're saying is we are not living in the modern world, but we really are living in a postmodern world. Now, even the phrase postmodern is a homelessness word, because postmodern just means after modern. It's like we're not in the modern era anymore. We don't know what we're in, but we know we're after that, right? And you could look at the world and say, this is a world of competing ideologies, competing things to say, how are we going to make sense out of the world? Have science and reason even broken down? Has capitalism broken down? Have all these different things broken down that we thought ordered the world? The truth is, the interesting thing about this is that's not really an answerable question. We'll know like 500 years from now. We can look back at this time and say, oh, actually, were we in the beginnings of something, or were we living in the ends of something? And you can't really interpret history as it's happening. You can try, But there is this sense of like, in the future, people will look back at this time and say, oh, here's what was really going on. Here's the ideas that were really interesting. So I love that in CWC, in the summer, we can push far enough to raise that question, even though we're incapable probably of answering that question. Annie, speaking of after CWC, there's a number of Gen Ed courses that have CWC as a prerequisite. So one of them is the U course, and you have at times at Bethel taught U courses. So tell me about U courses and how do they build off of CWC?
Yeah, so when I was a student at Bethel, I took quite a few U courses. They fit well within my major for social studies, education, and history. And then when I came back to Bethel to teach, yeah, I taught a couple U courses as well. What I love about U courses and how they fit in with CWC is that we spent a lot of time talking about what does it mean to be in the West? What is the West? And we start out in CWC, a class that's about Western culture. It starts in the Mediterranean, and then that's Unit 1, some North Africa, Mediterranean region. Unit 2, we start expanding a little bit more. We see more of like Central and Northern Europe being involved in our main story. And then by Unit 3, all of a sudden we have the West going east. We have the West going to the New World, and we have expansion, and all of the negatives and the positives that come with that. But that interaction, I think, is really interesting, and that's something that is talked about in U courses. So U courses are basically about any of the traditions, history, economics, politics um, of groups around the world, historical or contemporary, that are kind of outside Europe and North America, or outside the dominant cultures of those areas. And so if you think about it, most of the populations of the world are outside of what we would traditionally call the West. So here we're kind of building out this story of even of Christianity, but in a way that's not just bound to this one cultural or one geographic region. So for instance, I taught the history of China, Japan, and Korea. And it was basically like a survey history, almost like an Eastern Civ course, and looking just at East Asia. But there was a lot of overlapping themes and ideas. Certainly, technological developments are shared across East and West. You see expansion from the West to other areas of the world, like in East Asia, mainly it was China. But a lot of these U courses are about like maybe Latin American civilizations and how those were impacted by the incoming Westerners taking over the regions. We also had discussions about great philosophical thinkers that rose up during the same time as people like Plato and Aristotle, someone like Confucius or Buddha, and how important those were to the region, and how, like, living in Korea now, I can see Confucian culture still dominant in the way that people interact with each other, the way that politics and governments are set up. So I think that they're really good for providing richness to some of the cultural lens that we get in CWC. It's also fun because you get to see and build out the story of CWC, in particular in places that aren't like American or European. So a lot of the courses, and this is a team taught course, CWC. So you have philosophers, political scientists, you have historians, theologians, and a lot of those professors also teach you courses too. So you can kind of go off into different specific disciplines if you'd like to within U courses. So for example, there's medieval Islamic philosophy as a course. Introduction to International Relations would be a political science U course. We have history of Islam, Latin American civilization, which is kind of sociology and history. So there's plenty of areas that you can go within U courses that I think are really fascinating. They're definitely one of my favorite types of courses at Bethel. Another really important course that I came across a lot as a history major was L courses. Sam, why do you like teaching L courses? What are they about, and how do they build on CWC?
Well, actually, a lot of it is what I talked about earlier, which is sort of how do we pick up the story of CWC in the West and move it into the 19th and 20th century. So if you're intrigued at all of thinking about, what happens to the West as we move into deeper into the Industrial Revolution, and we start to have thinkers like Marx, Darwin, Freud, Nietzsche, the world wars, those types of things in the West, and how they impact how folks in the West ask questions, how they think about the world, if we're starting to see a breakup of the habitation of modernity, and then thinking about that going forward, right? Thinking about the 20th century, a century of nuclear weapons, a century of genocides, a century of competing ideologies. But the thing is, an L course is not necessarily doesn't have to be a history course. Just like with U's, it could be you're in a literature course and you're reading novels written in the context of that type of change, those type of questions, or you could look at political ideologies, or you could look at history, or you could look at, there's lots of different approaches to that. But that's what excites me is in the L course, we're pushing the story forward really right up to today and saying, how do these historical questions become and naturally grow into relevant contemporary questions, and how do they shape the way we think, how do they shape the art we make, how do they shape the work we do, how do they shape our politics, how do they shape our society. So I think the L's function in that way, and really they are, they're not CWC part 2, but they are a continuation of thinking about those ideas, but maybe broadening out the approaches to that beyond merely looking at history or philosophy, although those are two fields you could dive into.
Yeah, awesome. And as we're thinking about the next courses you could take, we notice we're towards the end of summer CWC. So all that's really left is the last exam and what we call the exit interview. Sam, do you have any final words of advice for your CWC students this summer?
Yeah, so on the exit interview, you're going to have it's basically 5 short essays that you write. I think they're each around 250 words, so it's longer than what you would write on like a daily essay. But this is really kind of culminating, right? This is pulling together what we've done this semester. Now, what I hope you see in all of these is that they are a combination of writing about material we've covered in this course, but that mixed with personal reflection. So when I'm grading those, the two things I'm most deeply looking for are you talking about the things we've learned, but talking about them through the lens of personal reflection, right? So as you're answering those questions, use details. As always, use the readings, things like that. But focus on personal reflection. I should hear your voice in those things. I should hear your ideas. I should hear your thoughts when it comes to those things. So, don't be afraid of using the personal I in there, because I want your voice to be part of this. So we're taking the exam on Monday, July 29th, but then you will have until Thursday, August 1st, to at 10 a.m. to turn in your exit interview. So know that you don't have just one day to write all of this. So you can take that exam on Monday. If you want to take a day off, you can do that. I would say go look at the questions right away, though, just to know what you're going to have to write about. And then you could take a day off, and then you could start on Wednesday writing, or you could parcel those out and do a little bit of that exit interview each day. It just needs to be done by 10 a.m. on Thursday, August 1st. So I would say just come up with a strategy for how you want to approach that. My hope is that your goal is not merely how can I get this done as quickly as possible, but give yourself time to think, give yourself time to reflect, because that's what I'm going to be looking for in your writing. Students, that is all the time that we have for this segment. We'll be back in a few seconds to play our final game of Food Chain. And we're back. We're going to play our final game of Food Chain. So this is our chance to review lots of material for your exam tomorrow. We have each made our lists of our 5 most important people for this unit. We tried to avoid overlap as much as possible because we want to give you the most review possible for this exam. Annie, I will say this is the 6th game that we've played this semester. so far we've played 5 games. You've won 2, I've won 2, and we've tied 1. So this is the determining game with the student vote. So we got to go all out with this. Top 5 most important people from Unit 3. Who do you have at number 5?
Well, okay. I do remember, I think that the last time we played this game, you swept. Is that correct?
I did win, yes.
So I need to now really, prove myself. But my number 5, and I think it's a good one, I think he needs to be on the list, is Karl Marx. So it's somebody that we spend some time in CWC talking about. I think that, I mean, there are full courses about this man and about his ideology. He's incredibly important for political science, political theory, both historically and contemporary. And I think he's a good voice for some of the criticisms we have coming out of the Enlightenment and out of technological development and industrial revolution, and saying like there's actually some parts of society that are separated from receiving the same amount as other parts of society. And so we get this idea of like the bourgeoisie, the proletariat, the working class, versus like the owners of wealth, the owners of the means of production, and that these are in conflict with one another. And this political theory is providing something new. So when you take like a political science class and you're learning about theory, you have realists, you have liberals, and then you have critical theorists. And this would fall under that third critical theorist ideology. And it's incredibly influential for how societies and governments start to develop in different ways. And it kind of provides an alternative to what we see with democratic revolutions towards the end of Unit 3. And so we have Marx, who kind of built off the ideas of Adam Smith, and he created science, or he called communism scientific socialism. And he joined others in rejecting Christianity and Christian traditions, especially in his political theorizing. And so it's also important for CWC because it's important for the West. It's important for the West and its interaction with non-Western countries. And it's important for how Christianity is continuing to change and develop, lose power, gain power over the trajectory of CWC as a class. So certainly as somebody living in a country in East Asia that has been that experienced warfare over the competing ideologies of democracy and communism, I see to this day remnants of that struggle, commemorated in memorials, in museums, talked about by people. It's still such an important part and identifying factor of who you are if you live in South Korea, to be like, I am South Korean and I value my democracy, my very new democracy. And I am generally the most of the population would say like, we are not okay with this other form, this alternative to democracy. Now, I'm not saying that this is all coming down to Karl Marx. Certainly, he's a political and economic theorist, like coming up with the ideas of Marxism. But I think that he's somebody who influenced global revolutions that we see later on, especially in those L courses that you were talking about later, Sam. So I think that the social transformation that is born out of his theories is something that you just can't ignore in CWC. And so again, we see more and more of that in the West and outside of the West through the 19th and 20th centuries. Sam, who's your number 5?
I like that you have Marx on the list because I think it's important that we have some of those 19th century folks who are pushing the kind of rational ideas of the Enlightenment to their full extent. I have another one of those later on in this list, but at number 5, I have somebody who actually pairs really nicely with Marx. I have Adam Smith. So Adam Smith is an earlier figure than Marx. In lots of ways, Marx is responding to Adam Smith. Smith is an Enlightenment figure who is the father of laissez-faire capitalism, right? So if we're thinking about the Enlightenment as this project to say, can we take reason and this notion of laws of nature and apply that to all aspects of life, even things beyond the physical sciences? Smith does this with economics and makes the case that actually we don't need to tinker with economic markets. We don't need to regulate economic markets. Instead, the what he calls the invisible hand, these natural laws of economics, like the law of supply and demand and things like that, will guide markets if we just take our hands off them. Laissez-faire literally means let it be. If you let go, that the markets will take care of themselves. Now, uh, Smith is doing this, assuming everyone will be a rational economic actor, right? And that will sort of guide these laws. Now, there's lots of pros and cons to Smith. And we live in a capitalist society in the U.S., not a laissez-faire capitalist society, but a capitalist society. I think Smith writing in 1776, right, is those ideas sound great if everybody is starting from the same starting point. But that's definitely not how things are. People don't have the same access to wealth, capital, rights, things like that. But his ideas not only shape most modern Western economies are going to be capitalist to some degree. They also fuel the Industrial Revolution. So, in the 1700s, England is going through an industrial revolution, and they're out ahead of the rest of the world. But into the 1800s, we have this kind of Western industrial revolution. And that is fueled by the ideas of capitalism. So much of the world, if we're just talking about importance, so much of the world is shaped by this embrace of capitalism, fueling industrialization, changing materially the world that people live in. And then that's some of the issues raised by that industrial society are going to be the things that Karl Marx is going to be responding to. But I think it's helpful to have both of those folks on our list, one an Enlightenment figure and one kind of a post-Enlightenment figure pushing those ideas further forward. Annie, who do you have at number 4?
Yeah, I love that. I love that our number fives fit so well as like the theories behind capitalism and then the criticisms of it. I'm curious if your number 4 will pair well with my number 4, or if you have someone on the other end for this. But my number 4 is Wollstonecraft. I think she is important. At the top of the episode, we talk about criticisms of the Enlightenment or some of the negatives that come out of the Enlightenment. And she would certainly be, again, one of those voices at the time of the Enlightenment who is criticizing it. And so I kind of pair it well with Marx because I think that they both are responding to some of those negative ideas. So Wollstonecraft, she complicates our view of the Enlightenment as a woman, as an author, as a philosopher. She is widely regarded as the founder of feminism, of modern feminism. And so her ideas are like basically saying that Enlightenment values of fraternity, of tolerance, of equality, of justice, that those are only possible for a portion of society. And so in society, we kind of have two separate spheres. We have the sphere that's political and social, the sphere that's outward, where you are interacting with the community around you, where you have some social capital, you have some power, you have some authority, or at least a say. And then there's the other portion of society that is like the domestic sphere, and where rights are denied. And so women had been living within this system where they cannot get into the social political sphere, that they don't have access, and very few break through and have that kind of authority. And mostly when they do, it's because of their ties with a male, with their husband, with their father. And so she wrote and criticized Enlightenment thinkers. And she basically said, like, look, if we are really exemplifying the spirit of Enlightenment, that needs to include women. Like, all people deserve to speak and think freely, including women. All people should be able to use their reason to understand their ideas. And all people should be given rights and deemed citizens. Because if reason is the factor that allows you citizenship and allows you rights, well, women have reason too. It's just maybe we don't have the means to show that reason because of the sphere that we are living within. And so if you give us rational, reason-based fellowship with the men around us, you will see that we are equals. We can engage in the dialogue of the Enlightenment. We can bring about change. And she does all this through the lens of education. And it's a really persuasive argument. And so her vision for the Enlightenment is that justice and equality should be for men and women, and currently it is falling short. I think she's a great person to have on the list. I also love that her daughter wrote Frankenstein, which I think is awesome. And if you haven't read it, I would definitely suggest you read it, and read it from a feminist perspective, because certainly there's a lot of kind of interesting parts of that book where you could see like, oh, okay, her mother is the founder of feminism, and I see that in the way that this story is unfolding. So she is my number 4. Sam, who's your number 4?
Well, my number 4 doesn't necessarily pair well with Wollstonecraft. It pairs better with Marx, but I have some later terms that will pair with Wollstonecraft. So I put Friedrich Nietzsche on here. As I said, I think it's important to look at those kind of 19th century figures who pushed the Enlightenment further forward. And Nietzsche, I think, is kind of the prime example of that, especially if we're thinking about religion and how we think about who human beings are. The big push of the Enlightenment with the Newtonian kind of mechanical worldview of this, the world is this big machine that runs on laws of nature. One of the things that happens then is you get deism, right? You get this idea that like, okay, well, if the world runs on these rational laws of nature, then what role does God play? Because God doesn't need to be active in the world in the same way. So deists are going to say, well, God is the author of this, right? God created this world. He set the things in motion, but God is then like separate from the world, right? This is the idea of God is the great watchmaker, right? He builds the watch, the machine that is the world. He winds it up and sets it in motion and then doesn't intervene. So deists give us this picture of the world, and then God is sort of floating above the world, but not deeply connected to it, but just kind of tethered to the world by virtue of it being God's creation. And one of the things that Nietzsche points out is like, kind of, why are we holding on to this vestigial idea of God, right? Do we need to have God there? Or are we just holding on to that because it was so important to us for so long? So in some degree, he's sort of calling us to say, why don't we be brave enough to just cut that tether and say, actually, that's just an outdated idea that we are holding on to. So Nietzsche famously writes, that God is dead and we have killed him. He's writing this right at the end of the 19th century. And he doesn't literally mean that God once existed and we killed God, but he's saying God used to exist as an idea of this thing that we needed to give us comfort and make sense out of life. But we now understand the world better, and the next step for humanity is to acknowledge that we no longer need that. And in fact, we should celebrate the fact that this idea that we used to cling to, we no longer need. And that's the idea that we should celebrate that God is dead, and that we have killed him. We have killed the need for that idea. And he thinks that actually will make us better as human beings. So I think that's a very bold statement, but it's a continuation of what we see coming out of the Enlightenment. And it makes sense out of our world today. I mean, if you were to go back to the 1600s and be sort of out in the open atheist, like that doesn't really work in the West. It doesn't really work that well in the 1700s either. I mean, there are a few people, you get your Baron de Holbachs who are pushing in that direction, but it's pretty rare. But if you think about the 20th century, 21st century, right, it's a far more common point of view. So part of this is Nietzsche is pointing to, here's where we're headed. Now, famously in that piece where he writes about, sort of the madman declaring that God is dead and we have killed him, it ends by him saying like, oh, I've come too soon. It's not that this didn't happen, but you're not ready to hear this yet. And there's something prophetic about that, because by the time we get 100 years after he writes that, it's sort of like as a group, a lot of people have acknowledged that idea of like, yes, in fact, that is this old thing. And in a position like atheism is far more common in today's world, than it would have been. So, I mean, whether you agree with him or not, I think in terms of thinking about the history of ideas and social movements and kind of the history of religion, I think he is a really key figure for sort of pushing some of those Enlightenment ideas to their fullest extent, because what that allows for is for people to actually come to terms with, what do we think of that idea? You know, it's Nietzsche is a real no half measures kind of person, right? But I think that's important, because it means people of faith, it sort of creates an opportunity to really reckon with that idea. So I think he's a really significant thinker in that way, and for lots of other reasons. So I'm going to put him at number 4 on my list. Annie, who do you have at number 3?
Okay, well, my number 3 and your number 4 are paired because they're both named Frederick.
Okay, that's good.
Which you're great. So my number 3 is Frederick Douglass. Again, I have him on my list, and now that I'm looking at it, the kind of the first half of my list is quite Enlightenment criticism heavy. These are all individuals who are kind of extending the criticisms that we see in the post-Enlightenment world to their own contexts, whether that's Marx or Wollstonecraft or Douglass. I think if I were to look at my list and acknowledge that there is something missing, the thing that's probably missing is a theologian or someone within the church, a church figure. However, Frederick Douglass is a devout Christian, or was a devout Christian, and he uses his Christianity as a means to bolster his argument for abolition and for human rights activism in America. So I think he's important and influential as one of the most memorable civil rights and human rights activists in the West and in American history. He was formerly a slave who became a prominent activist. He's an author and a public speaker. He wrote about the atrocities that he endured, that he witnessed, the cruelty of slave owning in America. And he was stating it quite plainly, how this doesn't reflect the said or the self-proclaimed successes of the United States in terms of liberty and equality and justice. Like, he exposes the hypocrisy of this American experiment, saying, well, you know what, it doesn't extend. And in fact, it's allowing atrocities to endure on a grand scale. And so I think his memoirs particularly important, but also his views on Christianity, which we see. He basically says, like, there is the Christianity of Christ, and then there's the Christianity of America, or the Christianity of this land. And the difference is that the Christianity of Christ is the one that's good and pure and holy, the one that we read about in Scripture. The Christianity of this land is one that in practice is bad and corrupt and wicked. And he says that we should reject that type of Christianity and lean on the one that is true. And so he becomes this powerful advocate for civil rights activism. He supported the Underground Railroad. He petitioned for emancipation with Lincoln. He also was an important figure for women's rights too. So he's a figure that early on sees the intersectionality between like race and sex as two ways in which people are disenfranchised and their liberties are not given to them because of those identifiers. And so he stands kind of between the two and is a voice both for women's rights and for the rights of slaves. And so I think you couldn't really have him not on this list, because so much of Unit 3 is talking about the Enlightenment and these ideals, but also seeing how they fall short in practice. And certainly the enslaving of Africans, of South Americans and Central Americans for the benefit of Western expansion is one of those big themes in this class that is, you cannot ignore it, and still has ramifications today in our political landscape and in class and access to wealth now. So I have him on my list for number 3. Sam, who's your number 3?
I like Douglas on your list. My only critique is maybe higher.
Yeah.
So my number 3 is probably the most explicitly religious figure that we have out of the 10 folks that we're going to talk about. But he's also there to both embrace and critique the Enlightenment. And that's what's interesting, is I think all of these folks that we have who are critiquing the Enlightenment are also embracing it, but saying, but it needs to actually do what it says. When we're talking about rights, when we're talking about justice, when we're talking about access and those types of things. So my number 3 is John Wesley. Um, we talked in Unit 2, at the end of Unit 2, we talked about pietism. And Wesley is somebody who takes pietism. He's from the Church of England, but he's deeply impacted by German Moravian pietists. And that ends up shaping his own personal faith. He has his own sort of heartfelt pietistic conversion, and then starts to preach conversion. He starts to preach in the churches of England sermons not merely aimed at people's heads, doctrine, belief, but instead aimed at people's hearts, aimed at real transformation, real conversion. And he starts to get a real revival in the church, right? To the point where people are having kind of big emotional reactions to his preaching, to the extent where the folks in the Church of England kind of don't really want him in the churches because his services get a little too rowdy, maybe, right? As people are having these big emotional experiences. So Wesley just says, okay, well then if I can't preach in the churches, I'm going to go out and find the unchurched people of England and I'm going to preach to them. So he preaches in town squares. He preaches to farm workers as they are, ending their shifts, to miners as they're coming out of the mines, right? To say these are the people that the church is not reaching. These are the unchurched of England. And he preaches revival, and he really spreads the gospel in major ways because he's preaching this kind of experience of God, this emotional understanding of God mixed with the rational. Wesley doesn't reject reason, but he says reason isn't enough, right? He says reason can do lots of powerful things, but it cannot produce faith, it cannot produce hope, and it cannot produce love. And he says religion needs to do that. So we have this Wesleyan quadrilateral, right? He says we have scripture as something which should inform us and should be an authority for us. But then he also says, along with scripture, we have reason, we have tradition, and we have experience, right? And he says all of those things together speak to our understanding of God and our religious understanding and speak with a kind of religious authority. So in some ways, I feel like he's summarizing or synthesizing some of these debates that we've seen. Is Christianity a thing of the head? Is it a thing of the heart? Do we understand God through reason? Do we understand God through experience? We see that whenever I think of experience, I think back to Augustine's Confessions, right? There's something important about him writing about not just his thoughts about God, but his experience of God. And Wesley really ties that together. And then Wesley begins the Methodist movement, which becomes the Methodist Church. And Methodism becomes so essential for American Christianity. Because if you think about it, one of the pieces of American history is westward expansion. And as people are expanding to the American frontier, they're not expanding to cities with churches and things like that. So how do you bring the church to, people living in the frontier? Well, it's Methodist circuit preachers. Now, Wesley doesn't do this, but the Methodists do, right? The people following after him, literally preachers who spend their lives riding a circuit, going to different places on the frontier, bringing the gospel, preaching the gospel, and setting up church communities, religious communities around the American frontier. So Wesley is a crucial person for thinking about Christianity and maybe that tension between the age of reason and an age of religious revival like the Great Awakenings. So I think he's important to have on this list. Annie, who do you have at number 2?
Yeah, I think if I had a 6th spot, that would have been where he was. He needs to be on the list, and I acknowledge I don't have him. But my number 2 is someone that, knowing you, Sam, I know he will be on your list, whether it's 2 or 1, we'll see. But my number 2 is Sir Isaac Newton. I know you, and I know how much you discuss how he is a paradigm shift in CWC. And that's absolutely right. He's the father of modern science. He develops these theories of how the universe works, explains it through his laws of gravity and his laws of nature. He not only explains why things happen, but he helps us to plan for things through the prediction of, like, if these things happen over and over again, we can then see that this is a pattern in the future. So he helps us to predict regularity in nature and explain it. So it's just making the scientific method something more concrete and modern, specifically the way that we still look at science today. And so I think if I didn't have him on my list, that would just be an affront to this class and to you personally, Sam. So I'm gonna let you really dive into Sir Isaac Newton wherever you have him on your list, because I'm fairly confident that he's on yours.
I like that you have Newton on your list. The only thing I would say is, but higher, right? Does he not have to be number one? So my number two is someone who I think connects with Douglas, definitely connects with Douglas. I think connects with Wollstonecraft, and that is Eluda Equiano. So Equiano is, I was going to say Equiano is kind of the British Douglas, but Douglas is really the American Equiano, because Equiano is a century earlier. He's somebody who is born in West Africa. He is sold into slavery, brought to the New World, is enslaved, ends up purchasing his own freedom, educating himself, teaching himself to read. He goes back to England, and he writes. He writes an account of his life, and this is really important, because what he's doing when he writes this book is he is shedding light on the realities of the slave trade, on the realities of the Middle Passage, right? The literal trip across the Atlantic Ocean, and how horrific that is, and then what the horrors of slavery looks like from someone who is himself enslaved. Now, what's important about this is that the English economy, much like the American economy, rests on slavery, rests on the practice of slavery. But there are lots of people in England in the 1700s, because the slavery isn't happening in England; it's happening in the Western Hemisphere. But because of the triangle of trade, England is deeply part of this, right? So they're not they don't need to be as involved sort of face to face with it. So there's a degree to which there are lots of people in England who can benefit from slavery but don't have to look at it. And Equiano is sort of forcing them to say, you have to understand the realities of what your economy is based upon. And in doing this, he sheds light on this, and he becomes a major figure in the abolition movement in England. So by the early 1800s, the slave trade is abolished through English Parliament. And Equiano, by writing this book, which becomes a bestseller, is a huge piece of that. And much like Wollstonecraft, he is pointing to the Enlightenment, to the values of the Enlightenment. It says the Enlightenment values the individual. The Enlightenment values natural rights. The Enlightenment values reason. But it denies rights. It denies the possession of reason to the enslaved African. It says, we don't think you have reason, so you don't deserve education. And then he says, well, okay, so what is the argument they make for why we don't deserve education? And he says, well, it's because they say it's because we don't have reason. He says, well, it's unfair to deny people access to education, and then to justify that denial to say, well, it's because you're not educated. It's like that's circular logic. It's the same thing Wollstonecraft is saying, right? You can't deny people access and then deny them rights because you denied them access, right? It's just like that's the problem. And there are people who say, like, well, you would need reason. If you had reason, you could produce art and culture and all of these things and literature. And Equiano's book, Equiano as a person, stands as an affront to that. He says, like, look at me. I am educated. I wrote this book. I've done these things. So you can't say that I don't possess reason. Therefore you can't say I don't possess rights. This is about access. This isn't about something that is natural within me. So I think I think Equiano makes such an important critique of the Enlightenment. And I think there are echoes with Wollstonecraft. There are echoes with Douglas. So really important. He's number 2 on my list. Annie, who do you have at number 1?
And he's
Is
such a
it
good
Newton?
one.
Did you have Newton on your list twice?
No, it's not Newton. Okay, Equiano is such a good one to have, though, and especially if you think just like the power of story and memoir, especially any students who are like literature students or just like avid readers, to think about incredible significance of writing your story and how that can be a political movement in itself, or at least a political text. Like we see that time and time in CWC, the power of memoir, but also just in historical, like in history classes at Bethel and in the primary sources that we read. So yeah, love that choice. Again, would have been a number 6 for me on my list if I could do it. So my number 1 is not Newton again. I'm guessing your number 1 is Newton, Sam. And it's because, of course, we have a scientific paradigm shift. But my number 1 is a political paradigm shift. And so that's why I have John Locke as my number 1. I'm somebody who, my degree is in international relations. My master's is in that. I worked for the state government. Like, I kind of need to have him as my number 1, simply also for the fact that he pairs so well with Marx, who is my number 5, in that in the future, we see physical boundaries of these national borders around the world being shaped by ideological boundaries, right? So it's kind of like a shift from the physical, which we still have, of course, but now an ideological boundary. Like, would you define yourself as a more like Lockean kind of liberalism, or as a more Marxist form of government and economics in your political system? And you start to define yourself by, and your country by, those terms in the 20th century. And so I think that not having Locke on the list would really deny us of looking into the future for CWC in the 19th and 20th centuries, particularly. So for Locke, he develops this idea of society as built upon a social contract. And that's something that's entirely new. Before that, what they had was divine right theory. And divine right theory is that God designates power to those in rule, that their right to rule is literally given by divinity, by God. And the social contract theory is like, oh, actually, like your right to rule is the basis for political rights and civil rights and equal protection by the state. And it is something that comes from people, from the citizen. And that's hugely important for us as Americans, as members of a democracy, as a democracy that was born out of revolution against what was deemed a break of the social contract. And so I think that the legacy of Locke is this idea that if a government fails to represent you and your rights to life and liberty and property or the pursuit of happiness, like you can revolt and you can start something new that does reflect your values and your needs as a citizen. And that's really important for future democratic revolutions in the West, outside of the West, in places like South Korea with their democratization movements in the 1980s. It's around the world and it's evergreen. And I think it also provides us interesting conversations and connections between other individuals in this unit. People like Martin Luther, what would he think about these ideas of, well, if a government fails you, you can revolt. Well, we know that with the Peasants' Revolt, Luther did not reflect those ideas. And so there are a lot of conflicting ideas within CWC of our main figures over, what is the government's responsibility? How do people fall into that? And what is our relationship with the state, especially as Christians? So I think it's really important to have him as my number 1. Sam, how about Newton? Where's he at?
I like that you have Locke where you do at number 1, but my only question is, but higher? Like, should he be higher? No, Newton's number 1 on this list. Locke is a major omission. I mean, I didn't put him on my list because I didn't want us to just have the same 2 people at the top, just in a different order. But Locke is unbelievably important. But Newton is the guy I think to have at the top of this list. We've already said kind of too much about Newton at this point over the course of these webisodes. Hopefully you understand that shift, right? In the Middle Ages, the world was viewed as an organism whose beating heart was God. And why did things happen? Well, God made it happen. After Newton, the world is a machine run by these rational laws of nature. Something you could study, something you could understand. That shift is so big that when I teach on the Middle Ages and I talk about, the veil between this world and the next is permeable, and I talk about Hildegard of Bingen and mysticism, right? As a 21st century person, I can only pretend to understand. I really like, I have to really enter an imaginative space to understand that, because if I were to go home and my son were to say, "Oh, I just had this vision from God," my first response wouldn't be, "Oh, you had this vision from God." I would go to all these rational explanations first,
Mm.
because it's so hard for me to not think and I'm not like Johnny Science over here, like, but I think scientifically about the world, right? I think there are rational explanations for things. At least that's my first move, and only after that am I like, maybe there's something else going on, and that's because I am shaped by the way Newton shifts our understanding of the world. um and that's the easiest way that I can say it. I just think that it is so important. I don't think you have the Enlightenment without the ascendancy of science. And the person who is pushing the science to its ascendancy is Newton. Now, Newton himself would say, I'm standing on the shoulders of the giants who came before me, right? So he's standing on the shoulders of Galileo, who's standing on the shoulders of Kepler, who's standing on the shoulders of Copernicus. But Newton is the person there, right? So he's the person I have on my list. So we have these two lists. Hopefully this is helpful for you as you're thinking about your exam tomorrow. We reviewed actually quite a bit of this unit here. So take a look at these lists. Give yourself an honest evaluation. Who do you think has the best list? This really matters because we're tied in this competition, and we demand a winner. So students, go on to Moodle. You don't have any assignments for tomorrow other than to study for the test and vote on who has the superior list. So go on to Moodle and place your votes. That is all the time that we have. We will be back in a few seconds to wrap up the show. And we're back. It's happy time. Happy birthday to Stanley Kubrick, the American filmmaker, and one of my all-time favorites, was born on this day in 1928. Annie, have you ever seen a Stanley Kubrick movie? If so, what have you seen? If not, are you up for a recommendation?
I've only seen one of his movies, I think, which is The Shining. Is that correct?
That is, yes.
Okay. Great movie. Watched it once in college, and then I watched it again post-COVID. Very different viewing on the second one. So I recommend it, but I'm looking for recommendations, Sam.
I think you can't go wrong with 1964's Dr. Strangelove. It's the one explicit comedy that Kubrick made. Peter Sellers plays three parts. It's a Cold War comedy about the end of the world, and it's very, 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 very funny. So I would say that's a great place to start with Kubrick.
All right, will do. Happy anniversary to the Walt Disney film Alice in Wonderland. Johnny Science, I mean Sam, what are your thoughts on this film?
I have weird affection for this movie, and not because I love Alice in Wonderland particularly, but I have this moment of when I was in graduate school, and we all have those moments where like you have tons of work you need to do, and it's a Sunday afternoon, and you just don't feel like doing any work. I was newly married, and my wife and we both had a lot of work we needed to do, and Alice in Wonderland came on TV just in the middle of the day on Sunday, and we sat and watched the whole movie. And so like Alice in Wonderland for me is sort of code for like burning a Sunday. Like what if you just wasted a Sunday just not working? And so I have great affection for Alice in Wonderland. It has nothing specifically to do with that movie, although it's a perfect movie because it doesn't, it's very tangential and and kind of goes off on these little episodes and moments. So it's a great movie for wasting a Sunday. So I encourage you, while you're in the summer, take a Sunday and waste it. It's time well spent. Finally, happy trails to summer CWC. Annie, this is our last webisode for the term. What are you planning to do with the rest of your summer?
Yeah, oh man, there's like 3 weeks until school starts up again in South Korea. So guess I'm just gonna try to like catch up on all the fiction reading that I haven't done this year, but plan to do. Maybe watch some TV, watch The Bear season 3. Yeah, how about you, Sam?
It's mostly now I kind of pivot to fall pretty quickly. So I'm going to be getting ready for fall semester for fall CWC, which you won't be taking because you have this final exam and exit interview, and then you'll be through the course. So congratulations with that. There's no assignment coming out of today other than, go and vote on go and vote. I can't talk. Go and vote on food chain and prepare for your test. And remember that your exit interview is due by 10 a.m. on Thursday, August 1st. That's all that we have for you. This has been a really fun summer. Say goodnight, Stacy.